Hi everyone, this is another game I played against International Master Peter Large back in 2013. It was standard 24 hours per move on chess.com and the game lasted about 6 days. My opponent had white and opened with e4, so I responded with e6 to French, which was my main opening against e4 in those days, as I mentioned previously. So after d4, d5, knight c3 and bishop b4, we have another winnower variation, which is one of the more double-edged variations of the French. And we went into the main line with e5, c5, a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight e7. And now Peter played knight f3, as he had done in our previous game, which was played about a week earlier. And I again played queen a5, which, as I said before, is a bit of a sideline. Queen c7 or bishop d7 is normal. In the previous game, Peter defended the c3 pawn here with queen d2, and this time he played bishop d2. And now I played c4, which is a committal move and it locks up the position. Usually in the French, black wants to try and get counterplay on the queen side, while white is attacking on the king side, and usually white's play is strong and difficult to deal with in the winnower, and I've stopped playing it since those days. And one of the ways I like to play in the winnower is to lock up the position like this, and then castle queenside and pawn storm on the castled king on the king side here, which isn't standard in the French at all, but it is kind of a fun way to play. It is somewhat questionable to castle into this open b file, and it can become a huge problem, but it has the benefit of giving black a clear plan forward in the middle game. As I said, just to castle queen side and then attack on the king side, and that's what I was aiming for in this game. So Peter continued with h4, because the queen side is now locked up, so he's got a completely free hand on the king side, and he's happy to start expanding there and gaining space. So I played knight bc6, just continuing development. Now h5, and as I've given up my dark squared bishop here, I can't allow white to play h6, because if I move my g-pawn forward, or if I was to capture, then my dark squares over here are going to be far too weak, so I can't allow that, so I played h6. And usually weakening your kingside pawns like this in the French is a serious mistake, because white's going to attack you there, but given that I'm intending to castle queenside, it's not such a problem. So Peter continued with g3, and his idea is to play bishop h3, which white does in some lines of the French, usually to support f4, f5, although that isn't possible just yet due to this knight on f3. So I continued with bishop d7, just getting ready to castle, and Peter did play bishop h3, so I castled and he castled, and the engine gives this position as completely equal here, which it's prone to doing in closed positions like this, where neither side is able to make concrete threats anytime soon. So I continued with my plan now, the rook d g8, and just simply g6 coming next to open up lines here to the white king. So rook e1, and now g6 and knight h2, and this could be called a small mistake, because as we'll see, it allows me to win a center pawn for a flank pawn. The engine prefers h takes g6, and after, for example, f takes g6, only now knight h2 and, for example, rook f8 and a4, and white can start attacking on the queen side by bringing his queen over and putting a rook on b1 and trying to build pressure there. And it doesn't look like white can get much immediately, but I've played that position many times and it's difficult to face with black. I usually defended with moves like king b8 and just bishop c8 and holding up this pawn here, but white can get very creative and start sacking things, and it can get very, very uncomfortable for black to deal with. But it's surprising how often white will continue to play on the king side in the French, as they should, but when black castles queenside, then their focus should definitely be there. I continue with g takes h5, And of course I'm going to snap off this pawn and open up the G file, and threatening immediately to play h4. And Peter was worried enough about this to play queen takes h5, but this is a mistake. He should instead play knight f3 in order to defend against this threat of h4. And once the situation is resolved on the king side, start attacking on the queen side, down the b file, etc., as we were saying before. The problem with his move, queen takes h5, is that moving the queen away from the defense of the bishop and moving the knight away from the defense of the pawn, it gives me this tactic, knight takes d4. And Peter continued with the queen takes f7, but actually white's best option is simply to take the knight and allow the trade. c takes d4, queen takes d2, and only now queen takes f7. And for example, king d8 to defend the knight, now queen f3, rook f8, queen e2, and queen takes d4, where black does have a clear edge, but it remains a double-edged position, and white can still attack on the queen side whenever he wants to. So after this queen takes f7, I can now avoid the trading of the minor pieces and get a knight to f5. And this is one of the advantages of black's previous play, is this knight is effectively secured on there. White doesn't really want to play g4, and if he did, it's not threatening to take the knight because the pawn's pinned. So this knight, yeah, is very strong on f5, and it's difficult for white to dislodge it anytime soon. And it also defends the knight from the queen. And Peter continued with bishop takes f5, and the engine really doesn't like this move, preferring instead rook a b1 or knight f1 in order to just defend and consolidate. So bishop takes f5, and now knight takes f5. And here black is now threatening h5 to cut off the queen's escape route, so there may be queen trapping ideas, and as well as simply playing h4 to prise open a way to the white king here. So Peter played queen h5, which just stops this pawn in its path, and the engine agrees that this is the best way to play. But regardless of that, black is now significantly better, with the evaluation at -3 despite the material equality. And it's black's fluid center, this strong knight, and the ability to create threats on the g file are what result in the edge here. And meanwhile, white has very little play, and he's faced with the frustrating prospect of having to defend against a big attack. So here I played queen c5, which is just getting the queen to a much better square, and the removal of this d4 pawn has of course allowed that to happen, and threatening knight takes g3, exploiting this pin. And that all looked very good to me, but there was in fact a stronger move, which was d4 right away. It's again exploiting the pin on the c pawn, and the idea is to play bishop c6 next. For example, queen h3, now bishop c6, threatening queen d5, and mate on h1. And this is pretty tough to deal with. For example, knight g4 is one possible move, but then simply rook d8, and after, for example, knight f6, d takes c3, bishop e3, and h5, black is winning by a mile with the evaluation going past -4. So that was one idea, and that's a recurring theme in the positions for the whole game, this bishop getting to c6 and attacking on the light squares. So yeah, queen c5 is the move that I played anyway. And Peter's response was bishop e3, which defends against the threat of knight takes g3, and apparently gains a tempo due to the attack on the queen. And he'd be more than happy if I traded this nice f5 knight for the bishop, and I'm of course not going to do that. But there's a significant problem with this move. If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Rook takes g3 check is the problem, which is an exchange sack that decimates white's position. And we can see the advantages now in having these open lines towards the white king. And white doesn't have much choice here but to accept. So f takes g3. If instead king f1, then d4, and bishop takes d4 is one way to play. Bishop f4 is also possible, but just rook takes c3 is going to be crushing. So bishop takes d4, and now queen d5. It's threatening queen g2 and mate to follow, and white can't ever take the rook because knight takes g3 is going to fork the king and the queen. So he has to play something like rook a d1, but now queen g2 check, king e2, and now bishop e8 simply is trapping the queen. Although that's not white's biggest problem because he's going to continue to face a huge attack. So essentially he has to accept this exchange sack. So f takes g3, and now knight takes e3. And after this continuation, black has a pawn and the initiative for the exchange. So he's threatening knight takes c2 with check, winning back the exchange right away and creating all manner of other threats. So Peter moved out of the firing line with king h1. If he gives the exchange back right away with rook takes e3, this is just going to be hopeless after queen takes e3, king g2, and now bishop c6 with ideas like d4 next. And the engine prefers at this point queen e2 in order to defend. So say knight takes c2 check, queen f2, now b6, rook ec1, knight takes a1, rook takes a1, and black is going to win this endgame quite easily. But it's still the best of a few bad options. But anyway, Peter played king h1, and now I played d4, and this is the best move, although it's obviously not very hard to find. The idea is just bishop c6 to activate this bishop, which is going to be very powerful on the light squares. Knight takes c2, just winning back the exchange and the pawn is also fine, but I prefer to keep this strong knight on the board. So black is now threatening rook f8 and queen c6, which is actually going to force mate if white does nothing about it. So here white should play c takes d4 or knight f3 in order to defend, but Peter played queen e2. So now comes a crushing bishop c6 check, which is in fact forcing mate at depth 35. Peter played king g1, which allows me to mate in 13. The best defensive move was knight f3, but it merely delays the mate. For example, rook f8, and say c takes d4, now queen takes d4, it's exploiting the pin. The knight falls after queen takes e3, but then comes queen g4, and this is completely crushing on the light squares. For example, rook e2 is best, but now simply bishop takes e3 and queen takes f3 is actually forced to delay the mate here. King h2, if white doesn't want to give up his queen, is the best. And then would come queen h5 check, king g1, and queen h1 check, king f2, bishop takes e2 with check from the rook, so king takes e2, and now not taking the rook but just queen g2 check, king d1, and now rook f1 check, queen e1 is forced, but now c3 threatening queen d2 is going to be game over. If white moves the king away, then obviously his queen falls with check, and if he takes the rook, then queen d2 is mate. And another possibility at this point, if king g1 instead, then queen takes g3 check, king f1, and now bishop d2 g2 check, which is double check from the rook and the bishop, so king g1 is forced, now rook f1 check, rook takes f1, bishop f3 check, forces rook g2, and now queen takes g2 is mate. So king g1 is what Peter did play after bishop c6, and I played queen d5 because I wanted to play on the light squares, of course, but this wasn't even the best move. A much stronger was rook f8, threatening queen takes e5 and taking on g3 and a mating attack. And there's no way for white to defend. If c takes d4 now, then queen d5 is forcing mate. So after queen d5, knight f3 is what Peter played, but this also wasn't best. It's the best defense is to offer a piece with the queen f3 here instead, but black should actually decline it here with queen d7, and white can try and defend with queen f4. It's simply knight takes c2, and for example rook ec1, knight takes a1, rook takes a1, and queen d5, and it's again just going to be crushing on the light squares. And it didn't seem like such a big deal for white to trade the light squared bishop for a knight earlier in the game, but he's sorely missing it in all of these variations. So after knight f3, Peter's move, I played rook f8, and here on move 25 Peter resigned, and this is going to eventually force mate regardless of how white defends. His knight is attacked, and how's he meant to defend it? If he moves it, then queen h1 is going to be mate. He can play rook f1 is one option. If instead he plays c takes d4, then rook takes f3 defends the knight from the queen, and it's going to be mate with the rook takes g3 next. So rook f1 is probably a better way to defend, but now simply knight takes f1, rook takes f1, and now not even taking the knight, but d3 first of all is totally crushing. For example, c takes d3, c takes d3, and the knight's falling after the queen moves. For example, queen d2 and rook takes f3, and just a simple win after that. So it was a nice game, and I hope you enjoyed it, and that will be the last of my own games for now, and the next focus I think will be on the candidates tournament later in the month. So smash those like and subscribe buttons if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.